Hello. This is Master GRE at Master GRE 2025 on YouTube. Here in this video, we're going to talk about the verbal section of the GRE graduate exam in the United States, and in particular, the vocab section. So when discussing the vocab, what I'm going to set up are several vocab rules to follow. Okay. So the verbal section of the GRE is split up into really two primary sections. The first is always going to be some sort of intro vocab, sort of like this. It will eventually rotate into passages, passage analysis, and then at some point passages will lead into more vocab and it'll switch back to passages at the end. So the exam in and of itself rotates back and forth between vocab and passages. So in this video, we'll be talking about half of the verbal section, and that has to deal with the vocab. I personally believe that vocab is the hardest part of the exam. Part of the reason why I think it's the toughest part is because it's all or nothing. So for instance, on, number 3 here, if you got half of this question but missed the other half, the whole thing will be wrong. There is no partial credit. It's all or nothing. So this can get extremely frustrating when you're trying to do a particularly hard question. It may be even like a triple vocab where you get 2 of these right and then miss a third one. That's a common complaint I get from students all the time, is that they get most of the way there but not quite all of the way there when it comes to the vocab. So hopefully these can be rules that act as a bit of a guidance for us to follow, and they're meant to be extremely straightforward but extremely helpful, so that you don't, on one hand, get these questions wrong, but on another hand, really overthink this section. I think that GRE in general as an exam is something that, it begs for you to overthink what's happening in front of you, when if you keep a level-headed mind and keep things really straightforward, that's where you excel the most, no matter how hard the questions get. So let's try it out. I'm going to start with the first rule here. By far and away, this is the most important rule, and it's that every answer is a perfect fit. Okay. Really underline and specify perfect. That might sound like a truism, sort of like, well, of course, what else is it going to be? But I really need to stress what we mean by perfect here. The example I always give students is, if I gave you the question, the color of the ocean is blank, and your answer choices are red, green, yellow, orange, and blue, which one of those is going to be the answer? Well, you would kind of look at me and kind of double take and be like, well, it's going to be blue. Like, what else is it going to be? Which is a humorous example, but frankly, that's how every vocab question on this test works. If it doesn't feel like that, if it doesn't feel like the color of the ocean is blue, then it's probably not going to be the right answer, because all of them are supposed to be that obvious. Now, if it isn't obvious to you, that's okay. But there's probably there's a bunch of reasons as to why it might be harder for you to figure out and not obvious. One of the most common ones is, do you know all of the words? Because if you don't know every word, you can't be 100% certain about what the right answer is going to be. And then usually it also comes from the sentence. If the sentence is really hard to decipher, it might not be so easy to pick an obvious answer. So with that in mind, this kind of cascades into several other rules. The second one being, if you are trying to convince yourself an answer is right, it isn't. Okay. That's huge because this really goes well with the first rule. If every answer is a perfect fit, if you have to spend any amount of effort convincing yourself that something's actually correct, it's probably not going to be. The joke I would say is like, well, you know, if the ocean really, if I think of the Caribbean's actually a pretty shallow ocean or sea. And because it's shallow, at some points it's actually more of like a turquoise. And, turquoise is actually kind of green. So if I look at my answer choices, maybe green is what I want to put for the color of the ocean, which sounds ridiculous as I say that, but we all do this on normal questions, okay? So it has nothing to do with how, you know, how correct an answer might be or how confident we are, but the right answer is supposed to be so obvious that if you have to convince yourself something is the right answer, it's not going to be, okay? It's just an innate ability we all have to try and make things work, but it doesn't really help on the vocab. So the third rule that really goes with this and kind of summarizes the first three altogether is that because of this, because everything has to be a perfect fit, you want to go into every question assuming all the answers are wrong. Not that they are right. Okay. So if this exam is hell-bent on you trying to confuse these answer choices, assume anything is potentially the right answer. If you go into this trying to think, well, anything here could be correct, I really got to give every question the benefit of the doubt, you're more likely to get this question wrong. You want to be extremely cutthroat. You do not want to assume that every answer is right. You actually want to do the opposite. You want to assume that every answer in front of you is wrong. As an example, if I go down to one of these triples, it is far, most people go into a question, I'd say, thinking this is going to happen. Like, oh, any of these could be the answer. I really got to give everything the chance. When if you go into every question really thinking this, you're far more likely to get this question right because this is actually the reality. Most of this stuff is wrong. Only some of it is correct. And then you'll have to trace the few correct answers to actually get the right one. So you want to go into this actually being extremely cutthroat. You do not want to dwell on answers and really ask yourself, well, if I think about it, maybe it's this one or maybe it's that one. You don't want to do that. You want to be very cutthroat, be very black and white about these questions. It either is or it isn't. If you have to fight yourself, go back to the rule. It means you can't do it. If you have to convince yourself, it's probably not going to be right. Okay? So be very careful of that. So these are the first three that are quite important. The fourth one I just want to stress here before I move on to some specifics is that sentence structure matters. Okay. Sentence structure matters. Most of the time when I teach a class or a group of students or even one-on-one, someone inevitably looks at the vocab first, and they let that decide whether they're going to get the question right or wrong. So maybe you'll look at this and you'll go, well, I don't know what feckless means, I don't know what dynamism means, and I don't know what punctilious means. So I'm just not going to get this question right. That is perhaps the worst way you should look at the vocab questions. If you don't know the words, deal with that later. What you want to do at first is deal with the actual sentence. Okay. You want to deal with the sentence up here, because if you cannot comprehend the sentence, it doesn't even matter if all of these words are easy. You won't get it right. So I always recommend read a vocab question first, come up with your own answer, or at least a vibe or something close to what you think would fit here, and then go to the answers. Sometimes you'll have the exact word. Whatever you thought of in your head will be the answer, which is pretty nice. And sometimes it's close, but you've got the gist of what's going to work. Okay. So we're going to try this out, trying to implement a couple of these rules. I'll add more in a little bit, but I want to actually practice some of these. So let's try out over here. Russian author Leo Tolstoy wrote War and Peace from a blank point of view, because he wanted to convey what each of his characters was thinking and feeling. Okay. So, because of the way the sentence is written, my blank is here, but because this word, which is a clarifier, everything that follows is going to be the definition of this blank. So whatever my answer is, it must follow the definition of because he wanted to convey what each of his characters was thinking and feeling. So let's go through the answers. Does the word accomplished mean what every character is thinking and feeling? No. Does enormous mean what every character is thinking and feeling? No. Does ensemble mean the same as what every character is thinking and feeling? No. So you really should get down to D and E. Omni means all-knowing or all perspectives. Acre means harsh or rough. Think of like acrylic nails or acrylic paint. So acrimonious is to be very harsh with your words. Omniscient is all-knowing perspectives or being aware of multiple perspectives at a time. So that works perfectly, perfect fit, perfectly into D here, okay? This is what I mean, where if you looked at this question before I had answered it, you might not have thought this was such an obvious answer. But if I had switched out letter D with like third person perspective or third person point of view or something like that, then it would have felt like the color of the ocean is blue. So I want you to know every question always feels like this. It might just be a really hard sentence and statement to read and to decipher, or it might be harder vocab. So that's what I mean. I'll give you an example of how trying to convince yourself can be a nightmare in just a second. But this is the importance of, remember, every answer is a perfect fit. And so even if you know these three words, it'd be better to pick between these two. So let's try and convince ourselves. I mean, you really can if you want. So I prefer the cutthroat method I just did, but let's see what a worst case scenario is. So a blank point of view because he wanted to convey what each of his characters was thinking and feeling. Well, a very accomplished point of view, to be able to convey what every character is thinking and feeling is quite an accomplishment. So maybe A is correct. Conveying what every character is thinking and feeling is certainly a lot of perspectives. So maybe it's enormous or really big, because that sounds like a lot of perspectives. An ensemble is kind of like, I think like an ensemble band. So maybe that's a lot of people in a band, and we're really talking about, a lot of different perspectives. So maybe it's C. Oh, omniscient really works too. So you see how if you try to give every answer the benefit of the doubt, it ends up actually being a disaster. You really spend every question on this test squeezing water out of a rock, trying way too hard to get the right answer, when it's much easier to just cut clean, slice through these questions very quickly, very fluidly, almost like a feather. When you sit here and you're really working on every single answer choice, it just gets so exhausting and so tiring, where you might still get this question right if you did what I just did and tried to make every answer work. You might still get D, but on average, the amount of effort you put into that question is so much more than what I did the first time, when I was being just a lot more frank and cutthroat. So in general, try to be more cutthroat with your questions, because it gives you, it saves a lot of energy, so you can spend it later on in the section, especially on passages, But I really, from my experience, people do the opposite. They really sit here and they just stew on vocab. They'll just stare at words and try and convince themselves or try and make one word better than another. It is much more honest and much better for your final score if you just say, you know what, I know A, B, and C don't work. I don't know what D and E mean, but I know it's got to be one of those two. And this is where the second most important rule comes into play. Okay, so these are the first four. This is by far and away, besides the first one, this is the one you really want to take a note of. So do not be afraid to pick words you don't know. Do not be afraid to pick words you don't know, okay? This is huge. It is such a simple statement, but it's so hard to ingrain into people. I've taught people for months at a time, and they can never get this rule down because to a lot of people, this just feels like guessing. Like, well, you know, if I know it's not A, B, and C, now I'm just guessing between D and E. So people would rather force A, B, and C to be correct, one of those to be the right answer, than to just guess on one of the two left. Because if this feels like guessing, at least up here I tried harder and maybe it seems more convincing to myself, so then it feels more right. But all you're doing when you're trying to be confident in picking a word you know is that you're confidently picking the wrong answer. These first three are wrong, so you're just feeling good picking a wrong answer. I'd much rather you feel very uncomfortable, but potentially picking the right answer. Okay? It is always going to work this way. Because every answer is a perfect fit, if you have to make a word you know fit, but it doesn't, it's already wrong. So we already know that. Remember, the whole point of these rules is to not just help you find the right answer, but to make sure you're not wasting effort and going down the wrong path. Because some of these paths can really sit here and you're just trying to make ensemble the right answer, but omniscient is right there. And even if you don't know the word, there's a much clearer indication that it's going to be D. Okay? Now, the sixth rule follows right underneath it. In number 2, I actually have a good example of it. But 6, not nearly as important as 5, but it is a nice aside. So whenever you have a single blank answer, which is this intro part of the vocab here, where there's only one right answer for each of these blanks. If two words mean the same thing, it's neither. Okay. If two words mean the same thing, it's neither. So let's look at the second one. That Jane Austen's satirical wit is lost on some readers is blank, because it is so blank as to become a caricature. Okay, so it's because it is so this, it becomes a caricature. So caricature is basically the definition of this blank. We're complementing words here. So these are going to be comparison words. So this first blank, or this second blank here, has got to be something that means caricature. So let's go down to the answer choices. Well, flashy and showy mean exactly the same thing. Okay, I would make a bet with you that you cannot find a difference between these two words. They mean the same thing. So I've had people sit in front of me for like 5 minutes at a time, just staring at these two words going, oh my God, like what, how can I find the difference between these two? They mean the same thing. Well, they don't. Well, they do mean the same thing, but that means they're both wrong. So how can they both be right? They both can't be right. So you have to cross off both of these. So overdrawn is the right answer by default. Okay. That's how you handle these questions. So if you ever see one of these single blanks and all of a sudden you're like, God, how these work so well. They're the same word though. What do I do? Just cross them both off, never return. Don't even think about it. Right? It makes it easy for you. Just move on to the next part of the problem. So that's 6. Just a basic little quick thing whenever you see two words that mean the same thing in the same blank. Now, I want to go over this do not be afraid of picking words you don't know thing again. So here's another example with number 1 on this book, in this book. So the media once portrayed the governor as as anything but ineffective. Okay. They portrayed the governor as anything but ineffective. So this is an opposite of ineffective, which means the governor is good. The governor is good at what she does. They now, however, so now I have a contrast term. This is going to be an opposite of some sort. However, make her out to be the epitome of this. So I want the opposite of this positive. So now I want her to actually be ineffective. Okay. Sentence structure matters. People get this backwards a lot, where they're saying, oh, now she's the epitome of great. But before we said she is not ineffective. So she's already great. So however, she is now not great. So be careful. They do a lot of these double negatives just to try and catch you off guard. But if you take it slow and you follow through, even pause before you get to the however. Just pause here. Make sure you understand what they're saying in this first part. Then you can find out what's going to work. So I need to find words that are kind of negative, like ineffective. Brilliant, certainly not a negative, so I'm not going to pick that. Dynamism, I mean, even if you don't know this word, it kind of sounds like dynamic. Doesn't really sound like a negative, so maybe not that. Egoism, ego certainly sounds like, confidence or cockiness. I don't know if that means ineffective, so maybe you'd want to put this because it's a negative, but it doesn't really fit the word that's supposed to fit here. So you should, based on this rule over here, do not be afraid of words you don't know. Get rid of the 3 words you know and keep the ones you don't know. If you don't know feckless and you don't know punctilious, that's cool. Leave them. Deal with the words you know first. So if you know these middle 3, see if those middle 3 work. If they don't, just cross them off. They're gone. I know it's hard to get rid of the only 3 words you know, but I'm telling you, now at least you have a 50-50 shot of getting the question right, when before you just would have been stuck trying to fit it in here and just getting the question wrong the whole time. Okay, so with these 2 words left, you have feckless and you have punctilious. Punctilious shares the same root as like punctuation or something like that, so it's going to be very meticulous. You're very detail-oriented. It's not necessarily a negative. In fact, it's more of a positive, so it's not going to be E, it's going to be feckless, which means exactly the word we're looking for. Okay? Again, kind of like on that other number 1 I did with omniscient, knowing your Latin roots helps a lot. If you happen to be someone who speaks Spanish as a first or second language, or French as a first or second language, or like Italian or Portuguese, you tend to have, believe it or not, a decent head start on vocab because the Latin language shares a lot of the roots that English took from those languages. So, you might know some words in your second or first language that actually seem to compare pretty well with English, and you can actually lean on that to guess some of these words. You don't need to be 100% certain on vocab, but if I know what, egoism or ego means, and I know what dyna of dynamism means, or punct of punctilious, I can kind of guess what these words are going to mean. It doesn't need to be 100%, but I've got the gist of it, and that's all I need. I do not need to, and that's an important thing for you all to remember, right? You do not need to feel 100% on these questions. Everybody wants to feel 100% on these questions. In fact, let me add that down here. That's like, I'm actually going to make that number 7. I'll just put it down here. It is okay to not be certain. Okay? It's okay to not be certain. You do not have to be 100% on these questions. So whenever I'm doing questions, even now, most people say, well, I'll just memorize all of the words. And it's like, okay, well, good luck with that. The exam at this point is like AI algorithms to be able to provide words that you've never seen before. So there is no shot you're going to know every single word ever. So you have to get comfortable with the idea of, okay, I don't know every word, but I can still get through this. This isn't a do or die for me. I'll be able to figure this out if I can cross off most of the answers. Now, I also want to do the second one here. because number 2 is basically the opposite of what number 1 is. And I'll explain what that means as we do number 2. Okay. So the whole point I'm doing these questions is just to implement these rules so you can actually see a practical example. For most of the first half of the 19th century, science at the university was in a blank state. Do you have any idea what fits in there yet? No. You can leave it. Don't try and assume whatever's going to fit in there. Sometimes you're just not going to have information until the end of the sentence. Okay? So despite, so that's a contrast now. These words like however, despite, although, these words are really important to the sentence. They're basically the spine of the sentence. They tell you where the beginning is positive and the second half is negative, or back and forth, like the opposite. The presence of numerous, despite the presence of numerous luminaries. So luminaries are like geniuses. Okay? They're like brilliant people, excellent in their field. So despite all these geniuses and a lot of positives, universities were in a negative state. They were bad, poor, something like that. So if you don't know scintillating, you can leave it. Pathetic seems like a negative term. I'll put a squiggly for you don't know it. Negative seems like a negative term. That could probably fit. Controversial seems negative. That could probably fit. Incendiary. Incendiary either means something that's very fiery or like a big emotional burst, or like something that causes instability or anger or something like that. So that could be negative. It seems a bit much for just saying something's in a bad state. And voracious, you can leave that as well. Let's just say we don't know it. So of the 3 words we know, they're all negative. Controversial and incendiary don't seem to really work. Not because I couldn't make them fit, but I don't want to make them fit, right? We don't want to convince ourselves the answers are right. But this sentence just doesn't have a lot of context. So if the sentence doesn't have a lot of context, I can't really force anything to work. But there is an answer here already that's just pretty good. Pathetic means like a very poor, almost like embarrassing state, which is a great opposite of someone who's like a genius and super successful. So this is a case where, don't be afraid to pick words you don't know. If pathetic already works, I don't need to even know what scintillating and voracious are, okay? So remember, that answer only ever works. That rule, I should say, number 5, only ever works when you don't know any of the words left and all the words you do know are wrong, okay? You only try words you don't know if everything you already do know is incorrect. Okay? So if pathetic works, great. Screw the words I don't know. I don't need to know them. Forget them. Great. That's one less pain that I need to worry about. Awesome. If all the words you do know are incorrect, then you have to move on to the ones you don't know. Okay. Then you would have to move on to scintillating and voracious. This, by the way, means accurate. To be voracious sounds like a negative term, but it really means accurate. So tends to be a good thing here. Now, the other one, scintillating, usually you describe this with like, I don't know, a meal or like a good show or a play you might have been to, but this means like shining, like literally shining, or maybe something that's really exciting. It's like this was a very scintillating dinner, or the show we just saw on Broadway was very scintillating, something like that. So 2 major positive terms here. So remember, you don't have to use all of these rules all the time. 5, I really didn't need to do here. I don't know what, let's say I don't know what scintillating and voracious means, but pathetic already worked, so forget it. I don't need to know A and E. So the number 1 and 2 here are just really nice examples of how one time this rule works really well, and then the other time it doesn't. And that's okay. It really just depends on the circumstance. Okay. Now, there's one last question I want to cover that's in a normal select one answer for each blank, and it's this one. Back to sentence structure doesn't matter. This one's kind of like a peak example of why sentence structure matters. So let's cover it. So it says, in stark contrast to his later blank. You have no idea what fits here. I don't know who you are. You have absolutely no concept of what's going to fit there because there's just no information up until this comma. You have to keep reading. Simpson was largely blank politics in his college years. You also don't know the answer here. So either he was later very involved in politics, but in college he wasn't, or it's the opposite. In college he was very involved, and then that's in stark contrast to his later, indifference to politics. We don't know yet. You have to keep reading. Despite, so there's our contrast term again, despite the fact that the campus he attended was rife with political activity. Bingo. All right, now I can answer the question. It took me all the way until the very end, but now I can do it. He attended a very politically rife campus, right? And despite that, he was largely blank politics in his college years. So that means he was indifferent to politics in college, despite the fact that his campus was rife with political activity. Okay? So he avoided politics in college despite it being very political. You have to use the sentence structure backwards here. And here's another contrast, in stark contrast to his later blank. So if he didn't care about politics in college, his later, he had to have cared about politics. This is back to a positive, or at least more active. So it's going to be, he is very active. He has more activism later in life, which is in stark contrast to his indifference earlier on. So it's going to be A and E here. I could not figure that out until I was patient, read through the whole question, and worked backwards. I very rarely answer any of these triple questions forwards. Maybe some of you have like a clairvoyant space brain to be able to answer like this first one perfectly. I don't have that kind of confidence in myself. I want to read the whole thing on these big ones first, forward, and then work my way backwards. So I have as much context as possible, and then I can go back. It's just very audacious to be able to go forward with such little context to try and put that first definition. Okay, I do want to cover at least one of these. So all of these rules apply to basically every section. The only one that's different is the double vocab. I guess a place to put it might be like down here, for instance. If I can actually find another blank spot. Cool. So 8. The last rule is for the double vocab. For the double vocab, you want the 2 words you pick, because this is a very different kind of question. Here you have to, there's only 1 blank, but from a word bank of 6, you have to pick 2. So of the 2 words you pick, they must mean the same thing. Okay? They must mean the same thing. Please keep that in mind. So let's try this one out. As my eyesight began to blank, I have no idea. I'm going to keep reading. I spent a lot of time writing about it, both poems and eye journals, describing what I saw as I looked through damaged eyes. He has bad eyes. Okay? Sometimes people say, well, maybe these eye journals are his eyesight improving, but all I know is that they're damaged, and we have no sign that he's getting better, so it's got to be getting worse, or it's bad. So the only words here that mean bad things are deteriorate, so that one looks really good. And what you need to do on double vocab is if one of these words comes really easily for you, latch onto it, and then ping pong this word against all of the others and see which one is a good synonym. So does sharpen mean the same as deteriorate? Nope, B is gone. Does improve mean the same as deteriorate? Nope, C is gone. Does decline mean the same as deteriorate? Absolutely, it's A and D. And then you would just move on. Okay? So in the double vocab, all of our previous rules apply. You just need to keep in mind on top of that the 2 words you pick must mean the same thing. It even says it up here. They are alike in meaning. They have to be synonyms. So please keep that in mind. It's a bit different from that choose one we had over here. So when there's only one blank, you can't choose two answers. So if two words are the same thing, they're both wrong. But over here, the whole point of the question is that I have to pick two. So you want them to be synonyms. Okay? So that's the last major rule. Double vocab, all the other rules apply. Same with, picking words you don't know and so on. It's just that you also have to keep this in mind. Scrolling back up here. It's a very good book, by the way, the Power Prep Exam Solutions. So these vocab rules, let's take a little bit of a spread out here. I want to be able to show all of them besides the double vocab rule. Again, the point of this video is to give you examples, concise examples, good explanations, and a good set of rules to follow so you can tackle the vocab section accordingly without overcomplicating it and overthinking it. All right, so that's what we were able to do today. And these are the set of rules, number 1 and 5 being the most important. Remember, for number 1, every answer is a perfect fit. The color of the ocean is blue. Every question should feel that way. And because of that, if you're trying to convince yourself that an answer is right, it's not. Just assume it is not. Go into every question assuming that all the answers are wrong. Do not try and be the, glass half full kind of person. You want to be very cynical going into this test. Everything is wrong. Only the best will prove itself. Sentence structure matters. You've seen me so many times today in examples working backwards through questions, taking my time, making sure everything's really consistent. Do not be afraid to pick words you don't know. I beg of you. It will never hurt you to pick words you don't know if nothing else works. We saw an example over here where I don't have to pick words I don't know. It's not necessary, but if all else fails, pick the word you don't know, okay? Single blanks, make sure that the two words you pick mean this. If they mean the same thing, cross them off, right? For single blanks. For doubles, it's the opposite. They have to be the same thing. And the good way to summarize this video is it is okay to not be certain. All right? It is okay to not be certain, but the one thing that is not okay is you cannot linger on these questions. You cannot sit here and worry. You remember from my first video on the summation of the verbal section, you have 12 questions to do in 18 minutes. That is on average around 90 seconds per question. You do not have time to sit here and go, well, if I think of a word on a specific setting on a Tuesday during a blue moon, then maybe it's going to be the right answer. No, be super cutthroat. Forget it. Don't even try to give it the benefit of the doubt. Say, I got to move on to the next question. If I don't know all the words, so be it. It'll happen sometimes. But it's better to just keep moving forward. You can always come back to questions, but the important thing is to not dwell on questions. It's okay to not be 100% on them. You can always come back though. This is the vocab rules for the verbal section of the GRE. I hope this gives you a decent breakdown. You can use this while studying moving forward, and I hope this helps. Take care.